What if the most celebrated secret America received from the Navajo Nation, the legendary Code Talkers, was merely a cover story for a far darker, more effective program of exploitation? In 1967, a file was created in a secretive annex of MACV-SOG, heavily stamped and sealed, Stealth Protocol 40 Sigma. This document proves another Navajo contribution was made to the war. A shadow unit of assassins who saved the Ho Chi Minh Trail by weaponizing their sacred spiritual traditions. This program was classified higher than the Phoenix program itself, ensuring its total historical erasure. We are not talking about radio encryption. We are talking about ancestral expertise, the spiritual practice of the quiet way, twisted by the U.S. military for silent elimination in the jungle shadows of Vietnam. The enemy called them unseen demons. American commanders called them too effective. The Pentagon called them non-existent. The year 1966 was marked by strategic paralysis for American forces operating on the borderlands of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The core problem was not the Viet Cong guerrillas, but the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a relentless, sprawling web of jungle paths and tunnels that proved functionally immune to conventional air power and ground forces. This network, sustained by relentless NVA, North Vietnamese Army logistics, was the lifeblood of the enemy effort, consistently pouring men and materiel south. U.S. forces, specifically the highly elite Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG, were taking catastrophic losses trying to interdict these supply lines. Every patrol was tracked, every ambush anticipated, and high-value targets consistently slipped away into the terrain, which acted as a shield and a tomb for the Americans. The conventional military response, bunker sweeps, bombing runs, and large-scale search and destroy missions, was proving disastrously ineffective. The intelligence failure was rooted not in technology, but in the environment itself. The American approach, rooted in overwhelming firepower, was useless against an enemy whose mastery of the jungle was near total. MACV-SOG, facing immense pressure from Washington to disrupt the flow of supplies, was forced to consider options that lay far outside established military doctrine. Desperation breeds radical thinking. This led to a classified proposal forwarded by a lieutenant colonel in special operations. If the terrain provided the ultimate shield, then the solution must come from a source that inherently understood that shield, a resource with ancient non-Western knowledge. The proposal explicitly referenced the successful, if morally questionable, use of indigenous trackers in World War II, but focused on a resource that was politically easier to access and exploit: the Navajo Nation. The target was specific: young men who still practiced the deepest forms of traditional hunting and tracking, individuals whose knowledge of stealth and reading the environment was not learned in a textbook, but absorbed over generations. Initial overtures were disguised as a request for specialized cultural liaison support. But the true purpose was revealed in a tense, unrecorded meeting between recruiters and Navajo tribal leaders. The officers were blunt. They needed men who could become invisible, who could neutralize enemy leadership without a trace, thereby collapsing the NVA's will to fight from within. A respected elder ceremonialist voiced an explicit warning. He acknowledged the power of their traditional spiritual method, the quiet way, the path of harmony, Hoju, but stated that twisting it into a doctrine of killing would cause an irreversible spiritual sickness, chaidi, in the warriors and their community. He prophesied that the victory bought by this method would be paid for not with blood, but with the annihilation of the warrior's soul and identity. The military men, desperate for a solution, dismissed the warning as cultural superstition. The deal was struck. The spiritual path was traded for strategic deniability. The Shadow War Initiative, later codenamed Stealth Protocol 40 Sigma, was authorized, and the recruitment of the ghost trackers began. The 12 young recruits selected for Stealth Protocol 40 Sigma were taken not to Fort Bragg, but to a remote, desolate facility in Nevada, chosen for its absolute isolation and its stark, harsh terrain, which mirrored the psychological rigor of the Arizona desert. The training regimen was designed to strip away conventional military habits and replace them with a primal, focused, lethal competence. Their instructors, a mix of shadowy CIA contractors and disgruntled, highly decorated Special Forces veterans, immediately recognized that they weren't teaching the Navajo Scouts. They were simply aiming them. The initial phase was pure immersion. Recruits were subjected to survival scenarios that tested the limits of endurance, teaching them to thrive in ecosystems far more unforgiving than the humid jungles of Southeast Asia. However, the core of the training focused on adapting their ancestral skills for modern asymmetrical warfare. The quiet way, which traditionally emphasized reading the environment to sustain life and maintain harmony, Hoju, was systematically twisted into a doctrine of silent annihilation. They learned how to track a man across wet stone, identify him by the faint, disturbed scent of soil, and move through dense canopy without displacing a single leaf, a process they internally termed zero-signature movement. The military fused this profound environmental mastery with specialized sabotage and elimination techniques. The scouts were trained on silent weaponry, wire garrets, subsonic ammunition, and specialized demolitions that left no forensic signature. Crucially, they were explicitly forbidden from following the traditional protocols related to taking a life. In Navajo culture, a hunter would perform rituals to cleanse the spirit after a necessary kill, maintaining balance. In Nevada, their handlers demanded the opposite: immediate, repeated, and unemotional killing. The warriors were forced to internalize the act without releasing the spiritual weight. This corruption of the sacred principles began to take its immediate psychological toll. Early observer journals, written by a MACV-SOG psychiatrist attempting to monitor their mental state, showed alarm. The doctor noted a phenomenon he described as existential duality. The men were masters of stealth and survival, but their increasing separation from their spiritual foundation was creating a profound inner rift. He wrote, "They are achieving a state of complete invisibility in the field, becoming ghosts before they enter combat. But the silence they master externally is creating a psychological vacuum internally. They are being trained to be flawless killers, but at the cost of being permanently chaidi, spiritually tainted and unable to return to their communities." The training concluded with a final, brutal exercise. Each recruit was dropped alone into a hostile, simulated environment and given only one objective: neutralize a high-value target, HVT, and disappear. All 12 succeeded flawlessly. The observers celebrated the birth of the perfect, untraceable operative, but the psychiatrist's final, redacted note warned, "We have not created soldiers. We have created a weapon that consumes the wielder. The price of this program will be paid not on the battlefield, but in the soul of a nation." With the training complete, Stealth Protocol 40 Sigma was ready for deployment into the deepest shadows of the Vietnam War. First deployments: the Ghost Trackers, 1967-1969. In late 1967, the Ghost Trackers were covertly deployed to the most hostile areas of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the rugged highlands of the A Shau Valley. They did not operate in conventional units. Instead, they worked in pairs or alone, inserted deep behind enemy lines, sometimes weeks before a scheduled MACV-SOG operation. Their missions were surgical: sabotage, reconnaissance, and targeted elimination. Unlike traditional reconnaissance patrols, they were not tasked with gathering information. They were tasked with erasing key elements of the enemy command structure. The results were immediate and devastatingly effective. Within the first 6 months, intelligence reports showed inexplicable systemic failures in NVA supply logistics, particularly along the routes running through Laos. Supply depots were found gutted, not by explosions, but by precise, undetectable sabotage. Commanders disappeared from their forward camps, often during the monsoon season, when their guards were most vigilant. American forces would arrive to find whole enemy companies in disarray, not from combat, but from overwhelming, sustained psychological breakdown. This efficacy was starkly documented in a series of highly sensitive, translated enemy field reports. NVA officers, steeped in political indoctrination, struggled to rationalize the phenomenon. Their diaries and radio intercepts described encounters with unseen demons or jungle spirits, creatures that moved through the thick triple canopy jungle without sound, leaving only a terrorized survivor or a neutralized comrade in their wake. One translated NVA report from a major found near the border read, "The sound of their death is silence. They fear nothing, not the dark, not the rain, not even the spirit of the jungle. They are not men. They are the jungle's judgment." The ghost trackers' mastery of zero-signature movement meant they were not tracked by their enemies, but superstitiously feared by them. The terror wasn't confined to the North Vietnamese. The American personnel who handled the extraction and assessment of the trackers' missions were profoundly disturbed. Special forces teams reported entering areas after a tracker insertion and finding the scene of the action clean, the enemy neutralized by means that defied forensic analysis. There were no bullet casings, no spent explosives, and often the cause of death appeared to be entirely internal, a knife wound placed perfectly, or a lethal dose of rapidly acting, locally sourced toxin. These reports began generating significant ethical backlash within the American command. Junior officers filed official hazard assessment memos, warning that the trackers' methods were crossing a moral line that could never be defended or integrated into post-war history. They argued the ghost trackers were too effective, too silent, and too far beyond conventional command control. The operation had exceeded its initial military scope and entered a realm of terrifying, untraceable assassination. The initial success was intoxicating to MACV-SOG leadership, but the overwhelming psychological horror was noted, foreshadowing a fatal reckoning for the very men who delivered the quiet victories. The Ghost Trackers, 1967-1969. In late 1977, the Ghost Trackers were covertly deployed to the most hostile areas of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the rugged highlands of the A Shau Valley. They did not operate in conventional units. Instead, they worked in pairs or alone, inserted deep behind enemy lines, sometimes weeks before a scheduled MACV-SOG operation. Their missions were surgical: sabotage, reconnaissance, and targeted elimination. Unlike traditional reconnaissance patrols, they were not tasked with gathering information. They were tasked with erasing key elements of the enemy command structure. The results were immediate and devastatingly effective. Within the first 6 months, intelligence reports showed inexplicable systemic failures in NVA supply logistics, particularly along the routes running through Laos. Supply depots were found gutted, not by explosions, but by precise, undetectable sabotage. Commanders disappeared from their forward camps, often during the monsoon season, when their guards were most vigilant. American forces would arrive to find whole enemy companies in disarray, not from combat, but from overwhelming, sustained psychological breakdown. This efficacy was starkly documented in a series of highly sensitive, translated enemy field reports. NVA officers, steeped in political indoctrination, struggled to rationalize the phenomenon. Their diaries and radio intercepts described encounters with unseen demons or jungle spirits, creatures that moved through the thick triple canopy jungle without sound, leaving only a terrorized survivor or a neutralized comrade in their wake. One translated NVA report from a major found near the border read, "The sound of their death is silence. They fear nothing, not the dark, not the rain, not even the spirit of the jungle. They are not men. They are the jungle's judgment." The ghost trackers' mastery of zero-signature movement meant they were not tracked by their enemies, but superstitiously feared by them. The terror wasn't confined to the North Vietnamese. The American personnel who handled the extraction and assessment of the trackers' missions were profoundly disturbed. Special Forces teams reported entering areas after a tracker insertion and finding the scene of the action clean, the enemy neutralized by means that defied forensic analysis. There were no bullet casings, no spent explosives, and often the cause of death appeared to be entirely internal, a knife wound placed perfectly, or a lethal dose of rapidly acting, locally sourced toxin. These reports began generating significant ethical backlash within the American command. Junior officers filed official hazard assessment memos, warning that the trackers' methods were crossing a moral line that could never be defended or integrated into post-war history. They argued the ghost trackers were too effective, too silent, and too far beyond conventional command control. The operation had exceeded its initial military scope and entered a realm of terrifying, untraceable assassination. The initial success was intoxicating to MACV-SOG leadership, but the overwhelming psychological horror was noted, foreshadowing a fatal reckoning for the very men who delivered the quiet victories. Consequences for the warriors. The elders' solemn warning that weaponizing the quiet way would lead to spiritual illness was realized with brutal certainty. The relentless stress of constant deep penetration missions, combined with the forced violation of their spiritual tenets, pushed the ghost trackers far beyond known psychiatric limits. They were forced to exist in a permanent state of hojosani, disruption or chaos, unable to reconcile their duty to the mission with their sacred duty to balance, hoju. The most visible consequence was a form of combat psychosis, unique to the program, far exceeding conventional post-traumatic stress disorder. It manifested as profound, crippling silence. Trackers would return from missions physically unscathed, but internally shattered, unable or unwilling to speak for days or weeks. Their exceptional skill at being silent externally had become a malignant, permanent silence internally. They suffered from debilitating hallucinations, not of enemies, but of the spirits, chaidi, of those they had killed without ritual purification. The military institution, which had relied on their cultural identity for tactical gain, now viewed these consequences as a dangerous operational failure. The once lauded ability to be invisible began to manifest tragically in unintended ways. Isolated incidents occurred, referred to euphemistically in records as internal containment failures, where a tracker, disoriented by spiritual trauma, would mistake a fellow soldier for a haunting entity. These were swift, silent, and lethal friendly fire incidents, immediately scrubbed from the official records. The response from the High Command was not therapy or spiritual counseling, but chemical suppression and confinement. The surviving ghost trackers were isolated in specialized secret holding facilities attached to military hospitals. They were subjected to experimental psychiatric treatments and heavy doses of psychotropic drugs, an attempt to chemically erase the spiritual trauma that the military could not acknowledge. The goal was simple: contain the liabilities, eliminate the witnesses. The warriors were not given honorable discharges or medical leave. They were simply incarcerated in a bureaucratic black hole, victims of the same policy of invisibility they had once mastered. The true tragedy was the final, total isolation. Stripped of their ability to cleanse their spirits, forbidden from speaking of their missions, and chemically suppressed, the ghost trackers were left suspended in a state of perpetual limbo. They were neither living warriors nor honored ancestors, but relics of a program that had successfully destroyed them from the inside out for the sake of strategic advantage. Post-war erasure. As the U.S. began its withdrawal from Vietnam, the fate of Stealth Protocol 40 Sigma was sealed not by defeat, but by political expediency. The methods employed by the ghost trackers, lethal, untraceable, and rooted in cultural exploitation, were deemed too ethically toxic to survive public scrutiny in the post-war environment. There was an urgent institutional need to sanitize the historical record. The goal was total, systemic erasure. The process began with a highly classified directive in 1972, known internally as Operation Clean Slate. This initiative targeted all hard evidence of the program. Personnel files relating to the ghost trackers were purged, not merely redacted. All surviving records were declassified under obscure ordnance codes, then meticulously destroyed or archived in remote, unindexed vaults, effectively vanishing from the Pentagon's official history. The men themselves were simply removed from the military's memory. The military lied to the Navajo Nation and the families of the surviving trackers. Those men held in secret psychiatric facilities were officially listed as deserted in theater, or chillingly, given falsified death certificates citing common combat fatalities or disease. This deliberate act of institutional betrayal severed the warriors not only from their service record, but from their families and communities, condemning them to permanent, undocumented isolation. This action ensured that any future inquiry into the fates of the men would be met with an unassailable bureaucratic wall. They simply did not exist. This total erasure was essential for two core reasons. First, it protected the high-ranking officers who authorized the weaponization of sacred knowledge from moral and legal accountability. Second, it protected the zero-trace protocol itself. By annihilating the origins of the method, the core psychological warfare doctrine could be discreetly preserved, refined, and recycled into future clandestine operations without any connection to the ethically compromised Navajo program. The consequence was that the ghost trackers became the ultimate definition of the disposable asset, warriors who achieved impossible victories, only to be annihilated by their own government. Their identities were stolen, their spirits were broken, and their contribution to the war was intentionally filed under non-history. Victory in this hidden chapter was purchased not just with sacrifice, but with the calculated, systematic annihilation of the identity and memory of the most effective men who fought it. Program continuation and leaks. The annihilation of the ghost trackers did not mark the end of their methods. It simply marked the purification of the doctrine. Stripped of its inconvenient Navajo origins and the associated moral baggage, the zero-trace protocol became a foundational, top-tier asset in the arsenal of American black operations. The core principles of spiritual terror, environmental invisibility, and zero-signature elimination proved too valuable to discard. Throughout the Cold War, the doctrine found new life, migrating from MACV-SOG to other specialized, deniable entities, primarily within the newly formed Delta Force structure and the CIA's Special Activities Division. The principles of the Quiet Way, divorced from their culture, evolved into specialized counterinsurgency training focused on deep-field psychological saturation. Missions in Central America and Africa during the 1980s contained clear, telltale signs of the protocol. targeted assassinations that left behind minimal physical evidence, but maximal psychological terror in the local population, effectively achieving destabilization without direct conventional military confrontation. The persistent existence of the protocol was occasionally confirmed by small explosive leaks, quickly contained and discredited by official sources. In the early 1990s, a retired intelligence analyst attempted to publish a memoir detailing classified budget allocations. The memoir was heavily censored, but one recurring enigmatic code, Native Consults Asymmeters Warfare, was left behind, suggesting continued, specialized procurement of indigenous knowledge. Later, during the post-9/11 operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan, internal budget documents hinted at the use of low-profile, high-impact counter-insurgent units who specialized in non-kinetic psychological dominance. These modern echoes prove that the original sin of the Ghost Trackers program was not merely a one-off wartime mistake, but the establishment of a permanent institutional template for exploitation. The U.S. military learned that it could weaponize cultural dread, achieve strategic aims, and then bury the human cost with absolute impunity. The invisible soldiers of the Vietnam War were gone, but their weaponized silence, the zero-trace protocol, lives on, a spectral presence in every subsequent shadow conflict. The ghost of the program persists in the modern military's blackest budget lines, continually exploiting niche, ancient knowledge for cold, tactical gain. Final moral and spiritual reckoning. The story of the Ghost Trackers, the weaponized silence of the Navajo Scouts, is ultimately not a story of a classified mission, but a profound, enduring spiritual cautionary tale. It stands as stark proof that the most damaging weapon deployed in the Vietnam War was not napalm or the M16, but the calculated exploitation and destruction of the warrior's own sacred identity. The ultimate failure of Stealth Protocol 40 Sigma was not operational, it was moral and spiritual. The program demonstrated that when a nation wins a war by willfully embracing and weaponizing the deepest forms of fear and moral darkness, the price is not paid by the enemy, but by the soldiers themselves and the soul of the nation that sanctioned the act. The forced rejection of Hoju, balance and harmony, created a spiritual debt that cannot be settled by a medal or a monument. That debt remains an unhealed scar upon the history of indigenous Americans and a stain on the integrity of the U.S. government. We must make a distinction. We honor the Navajo Code talkers for their selfless protection of their language and their nation. But we must acknowledge the Ghost Trackers for their tragic and brutal sacrifice as victims of exploitation. Their story demands not celebration, but recognition of the injustice they suffered, a recognition that can, in some small way, begin to heal the chi'idi, spiritual taint, that was inflicted upon them and their families. The only true resolution to this history lies in exposing the shadows. Fear, silence, and deniability are weapons of the darkness. Light, accountability, and remembrance are the tools of truth. The official records may be sealed, the soldiers may be ghosts, and the government may continue its denial, but the truth of the sacrifice persists. It is our collective responsibility to refuse to allow the American state to win its secret wars by annihilating the identity of its most powerful warriors. The fight for these men's memory is the final fight for their souls.